God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
Born in 1911, Ronald Reagan was America's 40th president. He was a Republican from Tampico, Illinois, and worked previously as a radio announcer and more well known as an actor. Despite being a strong conservative president, Reagan started his political career as a Democrat supporting Roosevelt and the New Deal. After joining the Republican Party in 1962, he gave a presidential campaign speech for Barry Goldwater, which launched Reagan to campaign for the governor position of California. As governor, Reagan originally raised taxes, but later cut government spending for education, welfare, and medical programs. Reagan later used his position to run for the Republican presidential primary, but lost to Nixon. After this loss, Reagan launched a greater campaign effort for the nominee, but again lost to Ford. Finally, in 1980, Reagan won the Republican nominee for presidency and the presidency.
We are going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American
As
people.
president, Ronald Reagan did a great job leading the country out of a recession to becoming economically stable. His philosophy domestically involved the use of laissez-faire policies and a trickle-down effect. Reagan believed that the government should stay out of private business as much as possible to allow for a fiscal market. To Reagan, pumping government money into the economy was not the way towards a better American economy. He believed that the only way to create a successful economy was through tax cuts and a fiscal market. The system that he used for economics was called Reaganomics. The system worked quite well, considering that in Carter's last year of office, inflation was at 12.5%, while during the last year of Reagan's term, inflation was only at 4.4%. Another statistic that showed just how well Reaganomics worked was that the country's overall GDP during his presidency rose from 7.9% to 12.2%. Because working on the U.S. economy, Reagan worked on other things like the war on drugs, tightening immigration laws, and working on civil rights for minorities and women.
Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Reagan's main focus on international affairs was dealing with the Soviet Union and communism. In the eyes of the president, the Soviet Union was viewed as an evil empire. Reagan called for a massive buildup of United States armed forces and introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative. This called for a buildup in ground and space systems to protect the United States from a possible nuclear attack. Reagan also introduced the Reagan Doctrine. Reagan would provide aid to any anti-communist movements as an attempt to push back communism in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. CIA were deployed to Pakistan and Afghanistan. They helped lead the Mujahideen forces against the Soviet forces. The United States continued to interfere in other countries in 1983. Reagan ordered for the deployment of troops during the Lebanese Civil War and the invasion of Grenada to back down the coup d'etat. In both situations, Reagan withdrew the forces before any issues were settled. Also, during his second term, Reagan agreed to use the force against Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi aligned himself with USSR leader Brezhnev and Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The United States then carried out a series of airstrikes on Libya. The attacks were heavily criticized and condemned by many other countries. Even with Reagan's views on the Soviet Union, in 1987 he was able to compromise with USSR leader Gorbachev and signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated a class of nuclear weapons. In November of 1989, the Cold War was officially over and the Berlin Wall was torn down.
Reagan's legacy was defined by many different events occurring during and after his presidency. Reagan, a president for the people, left a legacy with many mixed feelings. On one side, Reagan reduced taxes and tightened interest rates by the Federal Reserve. On the other, the national debt, trade deficit, and budget deficit grew to all-time highs. Reagan also paved the way for Republicans to capture the White House. Reagan had an even greater impact within his own party and carried Republicans into control of the Senate. The Iran-Contra affair, which involved an exchange of arms for hostages between the U.S., Iran, and Nicaragua, left a lasting image in how many Americans viewed Reagan. After Reagan approved these legal activities, which involved disregarding an arms embargo at the time, his image suffered but soon rebounded. When he left office, he left with the highest approval rating of any president since Franklin Roosevelt.